Halloween night had always been a time for mischief and fun in the small town of Mill Creek. Each year, the townspeople decorated their homes with flickering jack-o'-lanterns, fake cobwebs, and eerie skeletons hanging from the windows. But for as long as anyone could remember, the old farmhouse at the edge of the woods remained untouched, forgotten. Its windows were dark, boarded up, and the fence surrounding it sagged with age. No one dared to go near it, especially not on Halloween. There were whispers, of course, rumors of what happened in that house decades ago. The story was always the same. A family that had lived there disappeared without a trace one Halloween night. Some said they were murdered, others claimed they were taken by something unspeakable. Whatever the truth was, it was enough to keep people away. But not this year. Jake and his friends, Emily, Nate, and Sarah, had always been the thrill seekers of the town. Every year, they tried to outdo their previous Halloween adventures. Last year, they broke into the old school at midnight and swore they heard whispers in the empty halls. This year, they had their sights set on the farmhouse. "It's just a house," Jake said confidently, standing in front of the group as they made their way down the long dirt road. "We'll go in, take a look around, maybe find something cool, and be out before midnight." Emily wasn't so sure. "What if the stories are true? What if something really bad happened there?" Nate laughed. "Come on, Em. It's just an old house. It's probably been empty for years." Sarah, who had been silent up until now, stopped walking. "I don't know about this, guys. I've heard things, weird things. My grandma used to say that house is cursed." Jake rolled his eyes. "Cursed? Seriously? It's just an abandoned house. What's the worst that could happen?" As they reached the front gate of the farmhouse, the air around them seemed to grow colder, unnaturally so. The wind that had been gently rustling the leaves suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating. Jake pushed the gate open, its rusted hinges creaking loudly in the still night. They stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front door. The house loomed ahead of them, its windows dark and lifeless, as if it were waiting for something or someone. "All right, let's do this," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The door was locked, but a few well-placed kicks from Nate broke it open. They stepped inside, and the air immediately felt wrong. It was thick, heavy with the stench of decay. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly curtains. Emily shivered. "I don't like this. It feels like we're being watched." "Stop freaking out," Jake said, but even he sounded uneasy. They wandered through the downstairs rooms, finding nothing but old furniture and broken picture frames. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. But something wasn't right. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and every now and then they thought they heard faint footsteps in the distance. "Let's go upstairs," Jake suggested, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice now. The stairs creaked under their weight as they climbed to the second floor. The hallway stretched out before them, its walls lined with doors that led to what used to be bedrooms. Jake opened the first door, and they stepped inside. It was a child's room. The faded wallpaper was peeling, but they could still make out the pattern of stars and moons. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets yellowed with age. There was a single, dusty toy on the floor. A doll, its face cracked and one eye missing. Sarah gasped. "Oh God, I remember this. My grandma used to tell me about a little girl who lived here. She said the girl was found holding this doll when they found the bodies." Nate's face paled. "Okay, that's enough. Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. "What the hell?" Jake yelled, rushing to the door and yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. Emily screamed, "The window! Let's get out through the window!" But the window wouldn't open either. They were trapped. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further. Their breath fogged in the air. And then they heard it, a soft, distant giggle, like that of a child. It echoed through the walls, growing louder and louder until it seemed to be coming from all around them. Jake backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. This isn't happening. This can't be real. The giggling stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself. And then the whispers began, soft, unintelligible at first, but slowly growing clearer. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The voice was shrill, inhuman, filled with malice. Suddenly, the doll in the corner moved. Its head slowly turned toward them, its cracked eye seeming to stare right through them. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to anything living, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Sarah screamed and backed into the wall, her hands shaking. "We need to get out. Now!" Jake tried the door again, throwing his shoulder against it with all his strength. Finally, it gave way, and they stumbled into the hallway. They ran, not daring to look back, the sound of footsteps chasing them through the darkened house. As they reached the front door, it slammed shut just as they got there, trapping them once again. "Please," Emily sobbed. "Let us out." The house groaned as if it were alive, the walls seeming to close in around them. The whispers grew louder, the air filled with a palpable sense of dread. And then, without warning, everything went silent again. Jake slowly reached for the door, and this time it opened without resistance. They bolted outside, gasping for air as they collapsed on the front lawn. The cold night air was a relief, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. As they caught their breath, they looked back at the house. It stood there, dark and silent, just as it had been when they arrived. But now, standing in the window of the upstairs room, was a figure. Small and shadowy, it watched them with hollow eyes. And then, just as quickly as they saw it, the figure was gone. No one spoke as they hurried back down the road, desperate to leave the house behind. But as they disappeared into the night, the whispers from the house carried on the wind, growing fainter until they vanished completely. That Halloween night, the legend of the farmhouse became more than just a story, and no one in Mill Creek dared go near it again. There's a story that parents in Red Hollow warn their children about every Halloween. They say it's just an old urban legend, something to keep kids from staying out too late or wandering into the woods alone. But those who have lived there long enough know better. They've heard the true horror of the Harvest Man. It was a night much like any other Halloween. The leaves had turned a deep crimson, swirling in the cool autumn breeze. Children ran from house to house, their costumes glowing under the flickering streetlights. But not far from town, deep in the woods, something stirred, something that only awakened on Halloween night. Mia and her friends, Ben, Zoe, and Lucas, had spent the evening trick-or-treating, their pillowcases filled with candy. But as the night wore on, Ben grew restless. He wasn't interested in the usual Halloween fare this year. He wanted something scarier, something real. "Have you guys ever heard of the Harvest Man?" Ben asked as they sat on the swings in the park, taking a break from their candy collection. Mia rolled her eyes. "Come on, Ben. Not this again. That's just a story." Lucas nodded. "Yeah, my dad told me about it when I was little, said it was made up to keep kids from wandering into the woods." But Ben shook his head. "No, it's real. My cousin's friend went into the woods one Halloween night and he saw him. He barely made it out." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Saw who?" "The Harvest Man," Ben said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "They say he was a farmer a long time ago before Red Hollow was even a town. He was a quiet guy, lived alone on the edge of the forest, but one year his crops failed, and he didn't have enough food to make it through the winter. The story goes that he made a deal with something dark, something evil. In exchange for a good harvest, he promised to offer up the souls of the town's children." Mia shivered, but she tried to laugh it off. "That's ridiculous. There's no way that's true." Ben leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Every Halloween, the Harvest Man comes back looking for his next offering. If you go into the woods at midnight, you can hear him whispering. And if he catches you, you'll disappear. Forever." Zoe laughed nervously. "Okay, Ben, enough. You're starting to freak me out." But Ben was undeterred. "I'm serious. Let's go into the woods tonight. I'll prove it to you. Midnight's in an hour. We'll be back before anyone notices we're gone." Mia looked at her friends. "I don't know, guys. This sounds like a really bad idea." Lucas hesitated, but Ben's grin was infectious. "Come on, Mia. What's the worst that could happen? It's just a story." Against her better judgment, Mia reluctantly agreed, and the group set off toward the woods. The closer they got, the quieter the town became. The festive sounds of laughter and trick-or-treaters faded until all that was left was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The woods loomed before them, dark and foreboding. The branches twisted overhead, blocking out the moonlight. Ben led the way, his flashlight barely cutting through the dense shadows. "Why did I agree to this?" Zoe muttered, clutching Mia's arm as they ventured deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled around them. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. They reached a small clearing, the only sound now the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Ben stopped and checked his watch. It's almost midnight. This is where we wait. Lucas fidgeted nervously. And what exactly are we waiting for? You'll see, Ben said, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. As the minutes ticked by, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant wail. Mia shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. She could feel something was off, like they weren't alone anymore. Suddenly, the air seemed to change, growing thicker, colder. The wind died down, replaced by a soft, whispering sound. It came from all around them, echoing through the trees. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Words formed in the whispers, dark, unintelligible words that seemed to seep into their minds. Zoe grabbed Mia's hand, her voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" Mia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers seemed to wrap around them, pressing in from all sides. Ben's grin faltered. "It's just the wind. It has to be." But even he didn't sound convinced. And then they saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its face, if it could be called that, was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but they could see the faint outline of something beneath it, something hollow, empty. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It carried a sickle in one hand, its blade gleaming in the faint light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "Ben, what is that? That?" But Ben couldn't speak. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with terror. The figure reached the edge of the clearing, its head tilting as if studying them. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Without warning, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches reaching down as if to grab them. The figure raised its sickle, and in that moment, they knew. This was no story. Mia turned and ran, pulling Zoe with her. Ben and Lucas were right behind them, their footsteps pounding through the forest. The whispers chased them, growing louder, more frantic. As they ran, the trees seemed to close in, twisting into grotesque shapes. The figure moved through the woods like a shadow, always just behind them, its sickle gleaming in the dark. Mia's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. She could feel it getting closer, its presence pressing against her back. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out everything else. Finally, they burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the cold pavement of the street. The town lights flickered in the distance, but the forest behind them was silent once more. They sat there for a long time, gasping for breath, too terrified to speak. When they finally looked back, the woods were just as they had been before. Dark, silent, and still. But they knew what they had seen, what had followed them. And every Halloween after that night, Mia and her friends stayed far away from the woods because they knew that the Harvest Man was still out there, waiting for the next foolish group to venture into his domain. He always needed another soul for his harvest. There's an old road just outside the city limits, barely visible through the overgrown trees and brush that have slowly swallowed it over the years. Locals call it Devil's Mile, a desolate stretch that no one in their right mind drives down after dark. The stories surrounding it are whispered but consistent. Those who dare travel the road at night never make it to the other side. It was late October, the perfect time for ghost stories and urban legends, and Claire, Tom, and Jesse had heard the stories all their lives, but they didn't believe them. How could they? It was just a road. People love to exaggerate, make up tales to scare teenagers. Still, when Tom suggested they drive down Devil's Mile as part of their Halloween night festivities, Claire hesitated. "I don't know, Tom. My uncle said some people have actually gone missing out there. Like, real people." Jesse scoffed from the back seat. "Please, Claire. Your uncle probably just told you that to scare you. It's just a road. Let's do it. It'll be fun, and then we can tell everyone we made it through." Tom grinned. "Yeah, come on, Claire. What's the worst that could happen?" Claire sighed, giving in to the peer pressure. They were already in Tom's car, driving through the outskirts of town, and the idea of proving everyone wrong tugged at her curiosity. She wasn't superstitious, but the road's dark reputation still made her uneasy. As they turned onto the dirt path that led to Devil's Mile, A dense fog rolled in from the woods, swirling around the car. The trees arched over the narrow road like skeletal fingers, their branches twisting together in a way that blotted out the moonlight. The only light came from the car's headlights, which barely penetrated the thick fog. Jesse leaned forward between the front seats. Creepy, but kind of cool, right? Tom chuckled, keeping his hands steady on the wheel. Told you, it's just an old road. We'll be out of here in 10 minutes. But as they drove deeper into the woods, something felt wrong. The trees seemed too close, as if they were closing in on the car. The fog grew thicker, so dense that Tom had to slow down to a crawl just to stay on the road. The radio crackled with static, and Claire's phone, which she had been using to check the time, suddenly lost signal. Great, she muttered, looking out the window. How long have we been driving? Tom glanced at the dashboard. About 10 minutes, I think. Then why does it feel like we haven't moved at all? Jesse asked, glancing nervously at the trees. This fog is freaky. Claire stared out at the dense woods, a knot forming in her stomach. The deeper they drove, the stranger the road felt. The trees outside the window seemed wrong, twisted in impossible shapes. And the fog wasn't just thick, it seemed alive, swirling and coiling around them as if it were watching, waiting. Then, from the shadows of the forest, Claire thought she saw movement, a shape darting between the trees. It was quick, almost too fast to notice, but it was there. Did you guys see that? Claire asked, her voice tight with fear. See what? Tom asked, glancing into the rearview mirror. I don't know. Something out there. I thought I saw someone. Jessie rolled her eyes. This place is just playing tricks on you. Claire, it's foggy and dark, and your mind's making things up. Relax. But Claire couldn't relax. Something felt off, deeply wrong. She kept her eyes on the trees, trying to catch another glimpse of the figure. And then, just for a split second, she saw it again. A shadow moving parallel to the car, keeping pace with them. Tom, stop the car, Claire said, her voice rising. What? Why? Just stop. Reluctantly, Tom slowed to a stop, the car's headlights barely illuminating the road ahead. The fog curled around them, thick and suffocating. They sat in silence for a moment, the engine idling softly. Do you hear that? Jessie asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire strained to listen, and that's when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from outside, from the woods. The sound grew louder, like something knocking against the trees, steady and deliberate. What the hell is that? Tom asked, glancing nervously at the window. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, echoing through the fog, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then a soft sound broke the silence, a voice, distant and faint, calling from the fog. Help! Me! Claire's blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice, weak and filled with terror. Did you guys hear that? She whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jessie nodded slowly, her face pale. Yeah, I heard it. Tom gripped the steering wheel tightly. It's probably just someone messing with us. We should go. But before he could put the car into gear, the voice came again, louder this time. Help. Please, help me. It was closer now, much closer. Tom hesitated, glancing at Claire. What if someone's actually out there? What if they're hurt? Claire shook her head, her instincts screaming at her to leave. No, something's wrong. We need to go. Now. But before anyone could move, there was a sudden, loud thud against the car. The whole vehicle shook as if something had hit it from the side. Jessie screamed and Tom cursed, fumbling to turn the car back on. Another thud. This time it came from the roof. Go! Go! Claire yelled, her voice breaking. Tom slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the mud for a moment before they lurched forward. The car sped down the narrow road, the fog swirling in their wake. But whatever had been on the roof wasn't gone. They could hear it, a scraping sound, like claws dragging across the metal. It moved from the roof to the side, scraping along the windows, the sound grating and unnatural. What the hell is that? Jessie screamed, covering her ears. Tom didn't answer, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel, trying to keep the car on the road. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to get in. Claire looked out the window, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she saw it. A face, twisted and contorted, pressed against the glass. Its eyes were black, hollow pits, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Tom! Faster! Claire yelled, her voice hoarse with terror. But no matter how fast they drove, the road seemed endless. The fog was everywhere, suffocating them, blurring the world outside into a nightmare of shifting shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The scraping sound stopped, and the trees ahead of them parted to reveal the familiar streetlights of town. They had made it. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just outside the town limits. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, their hearts pounding in their chests, too terrified to speak. Finally, Claire broke the silence. Is it gone? Tom nodded shakily, but no one dared to look back. They didn't need to. They had escaped Devil's Mile, but they knew deep down that they had been followed. And they knew that whatever was out there would be waiting for the next foolish souls who dared to venture down that cursed road. There was an old mental hospital on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for decades. Known as Hawthorne Asylum, it had a notorious reputation. Locals swore they could hear screams coming from the crumbling building late at night, even though no one had set foot inside for years. The hospital had been shut down after a string of patient deaths under mysterious circumstances, but whispers claimed that something far darker lingered within its walls. One crisp October night, 4 friends, Samantha, Kyle, Rachel, and Eric, decided to put the rumors to the test. They had heard the stories all their lives, and like many others, they didn't believe them. Hawthorne Asylum was just a decaying building, haunted by the past, not by anything supernatural. But there was something about Halloween that made them want to push their luck. "We'll just go in, walk around, and take some pictures," Kyle said as they stood outside the towering, dilapidated structure. The asylum loomed ahead, its windows shattered, and the once grand doors now hanging off their hinges. The cold wind howled through the trees, making the place feel even more uninviting. "Yeah, just long enough to say we've been inside," Eric added with a grin. "Come on, it'll be fun. We'll be legends." Samantha wasn't convinced. "This place is bad news. I don't care what you guys say. Something happened here. My grandmother told me the staff did awful things to the patients. People disappeared." Rachel shivered but tried to laugh it off. "It's just an old building, Sam. We'll be in and out in no time." With flashlights in hand, they approached the entrance. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, much colder than it had been outside. The floor was littered with broken glass, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti. The smell of mildew and rot hung heavy in the air, mixed with something else, something foul, like decaying flesh. The main hallway stretched out before them, its dimness barely illuminated by their flashlights. The place seemed frozen in time, as if the doctors and patients had left in the middle of the night and never returned. Old wheelchairs sat in corners, rusting away. Gurneys were overturned, their wheels squeaking as the wind gusted through broken windows. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Rachel muttered, staying close to Samantha. "Let's just get this over with," Samantha said, already regretting coming along. They walked further into the asylum, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the empty corridors. Every now and then, they heard a creak, a groan, or the soft sound of something scurrying in the shadows. But it was more than just the building settling. It felt alive, as though it were watching them. "Let's check out the basement," Kyle suggested, his voice too loud in the oppressive silence. "The basement?" Samantha asked, her anxiety spiking. "Why?" "That's where they say all the really creepy stuff happened," Kyle grinned. "It's where they kept the patients they didn't want anyone to know about." Rachel gave him a nervous look. "I don't know, Kyle. We're already in way over our heads." But Eric was already moving toward a set of stairs at the end of the hall, leading down into darkness. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Samantha didn't want to follow, but she also didn't want to be left alone in the eerie hallway. Reluctantly, she and Rachel followed Kyle and Eric down the stairs. The further they descended, the more the temperature dropped, until their breath was visible in the faint beam of their flashlights. The basement was even worse than the upper floors. The walls were lined with old metal doors, padded cells for the most dangerous patients. Many of the doors had rusted shut, but one or two were slightly ajar, revealing the dark, empty rooms beyond. "Over here," Kyle whispered, as if speaking any louder would wake something up. They gathered around one of the open doors. Inside was a small room with a single, rotting mattress on the floor. The walls were covered in deep gouges, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. "What the hell happened in here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from somewhere deeper in the basement. Everyone froze. "Did you guys hear that?" Samantha whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Probably just the wind," Eric said, but his voice didn't sound confident. Another bang, this time louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. "We need to get out of here," Samantha said, backing away from the door. But before anyone could move, the lights on their flashlights flickered, then went out. "Shit!" Kyle cursed, fumbling with his flashlight. "What the hell?" A low moaning sound echoed through the basement, chilling them to the bone. It was close, too close. It didn't sound human. Rachel let out a small whimper, clinging to Samantha. "We have to go!" They turned and ran back toward the stairs, their footsteps pounding against the floor. The moaning grew louder, more intense, followed by a series of rapid footsteps coming from the darkness behind them. Something was following them, something that moved faster than any human could. They reached the stairs, but as they began to climb, Kyle suddenly stopped, his face pale. "Where's Eric?" Everyone looked around, realizing in horror that Eric was no longer with them. "Eric?" Samantha yelled, her voice echoing through the basement. There was no answer, just the relentless moaning and the sound of something scraping across the walls, getting closer. "We can't leave him," Kyle said, but fear had already taken hold of his voice. Samantha shook her head. "We have to. We have to get out of here now." Rachel was already halfway up the stairs, panic driving her forward. "We'll send help. We'll come back with..." Her words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream that echoed from deep within the basement. It was Eric's voice. Kyle turned back, his face twisted in anguish, but he knew what they all did. Eric was gone. Without another word, they ran up the stairs back, their legs burning as they pushed themselves faster than they had ever run before. The moaning sound followed them, growing louder, more furious, as if whatever was down there didn't want them to leave. They burst through the front doors and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. They didn't stop running until they were far from the asylum, until the towering structure was nothing more than a dark silhouette in the distance. They never spoke about what happened that night. No one would have believed them anyway. A week later, when the police searched the asylum after Eric was reported missing, they found no trace of him. But in the basement, in one of the padded cells, they discovered something chilling. Long claw marks etched deep into the walls, marks that hadn't been there before, and etched into the floor, in blood, were two words: "Help me."